Okay, so our final topic in systems of measurement deals with one final measurement, and that is a measurement of temperature. In terms of a definition, when we talk about temperature, temperature is a measure of how hot or cold an object is compared to another object. It indicates the heat flow from the object with a higher temperature to the object with a lower temperature. And as you are probably familiar with, what apparatus do we commonly use to measure temperature? The apparatus that we commonly use to measure temperature, of course, is the thermometer. Now, in terms of measuring temperature, there are actually three temperature scales that we come across. Two of them are probably familiar to you, and one of them might be somewhat new. The two familiar ones, of course, are Fahrenheit, often abbreviated as degrees F, or Celsius, often abbreviated as degrees C. So Fahrenheit, often abbreviated as degrees F, Celsius, often abbreviated as degrees C. And in sciences, especially chemistry, a third and perhaps lesser known to you temperature scale, but one that's used quite often in chemistry, is what is known as the Kelvin scale. And Kelvin, abbreviated just with a capital K, no degree sign for Kelvin, just a capital K associated with it. I'm going to come back towards the end and discuss this sort of reference point idea for the boiling and freezing points of water. One of the things that we want you to be able to do is we want you to be able to convert temperatures between the three temperature scales. And from my perspective, there are three equations that you need to know in order to convert between the temperature scales. The first one involves converting from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So to take Celsius temperature and convert it into Fahrenheit, you take 1.8 and you multiply it by the temperature in Celsius. So TC is your temperature in Celsius. And then you add to that 32, and that will give you the temperature in Fahrenheit. Now, you might be familiar with using a fraction as part of this equation. And a lot of times, the equation given for converting the Celsius temperature into the Fahrenheit temperature is to take 9/5, multiply it by the degrees Celsius, and then add 32. Let's just be perfectly clear. Both of these that are written here are equations are exactly the same. This one just involves using a decimal number. This one involves using a fraction. But this is how you convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Probably the more complex in terms of remembering correctly what to do is the conversion from from Fahrenheit into Celsius. Now, you don't have to worry about all the algebra that's here. What they're showing you is that they're showing you how you could take the Celsius to Fahrenheit equation and make that into conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius. Basically, we want to bottom line it, and what we're going to remember is the bottom, okay? That in order to get the Fahrenheit temperature and convert that into Celsius, you're going to take the Fahrenheit temperature, subtract 32, then divide that by 1.8, all right? The key here is to remember to do the numerator first and then the denominator. Now, one other way that the same equation can be given, okay? And let me just see if I can make that a little bit nicer looking over here. Okay, is to say that degrees Celsius is equal to 5/9 degrees Fahrenheit minus 32. All right, It's now, again, these two equations are exactly the same. The key here is to remember to do what's in parentheses first. So you want to take the degrees Fahrenheit and subtract 32, and then multiply that by 5/9. That's the key. So if you're using the bottom equation here, you want to make sure you do the numerator first, and then divide by 1.8. Here again, you want to do what's in parentheses first, and then multiply by 5/9. If you divide by 1.8 or multiply by 5/9, it turns out to be the same thing. So however, which one you want to remember is fine. But these are the two ways that we usually look at going from Fahrenheit to Celsius. And then finally going from Kelvin to Celsius, or from Celsius to Kelvin, I should say, sorry. The Kelvin temperature is obtained by adding 273 to the Celsius temperature. So TK, what you have here, is the temperature in Kelvin. Okay, so basically you take the Celsius temperature and add 273, and that gives you the temperature in Kelvin. And if you know these three equations, you can convert between any of the temperature scales. You know, how would you go from Kelvin to Celsius? Well, instead of adding 273, you would subtract 273. How would you go from something like Fahrenheit to Kelvin? Well, instead of going directly from Fahrenheit to Kelvin, what you can do is you can go to Fahrenheit to Celsius first. You take the Fahrenheit temperature, convert that to Celsius first, and then you can take the Celsius temperature and convert that into Kelvin. All right. So using the three mathematical formulas just discussed, you can convert between any of the temperature scales. Now, as I mentioned, not only in chemistry really, but in a lot of sciences, the Celsius and the Kelvin scales are used instead of the Fahrenheit scale. And there's a pretty simple reason for this. The reason for this is because the difference in temperature between Celsius and Kelvin scales is always 273 degrees. In other words, give me any temperature on the Celsius scale, and I guarantee you the difference in temperature on the Kelvin scale is 273. To be specific, it would be 273 higher. We do not have the same relationship between Celsius and Fahrenheit and Kelvin and Fahrenheit. In other words, I can't tell you exactly what the difference is always going to be between Celsius and Fahrenheit temperatures. It depends on what one of the temperatures is. It varies. I can't give you a set value of what the temperature difference between Kelvin and Fahrenheit always is. It varies, okay? Just to go back to the slide over here. In terms of the difference between Celsius and Kelvin, Celsius and Fahrenheit, Kelvin and Fahrenheit. Look over here. Celsius, 0, Kelvin, 273. 273 difference. Celsius, 37, Kelvin, 310. 273 degree difference. Celsius, 100, Kelvin, 373. 273 difference. Here, Celsius and Fahrenheit, it's 32. Here, it's 112. Here, it's roughly between Kelvin and Fahrenheit, 241 difference. Here, 151 difference, 161 difference. You could do the math. The point is that the difference between Celsius and Kelvin is always the same. 273, 273, 273. The difference between Celsius and Fahrenheit, not always the same. Difference between Kelvin and Fahrenheit, not always the same. And because the difference between Celsius and Kelvin is always the same, that's why in most sciences, they are the preferred unit used for temperature.